Zora and Me, Chapter 7. I had never run so fast. When we stopped to catch our breath, we were halfway to Zora's house and still clutching hands. Zora put her arm around my shoulder and we heaved air until we could talk. You believe me now, don't you? I nodded. I saw it. That night at the Blue Sink, I saw Mr. Bender with a gator snout, plain as I see you right now. It can't be no accident that old lady Bronson, a woman who's never been sick a day in her life, fainted and fell, and Mr. Pender only a few hundred yards away. Zora had stumbled onto something. I couldn't say what it was, but I felt it squirming in my belly. Back at Zora's house, Mrs. Hurston was busy fixing supper. She was relieved to hear how we'd found old lady Bronson. We never said a word about Mr. Pender, but me and Zora swapped looks all through the meal and dishes. After Mrs. Hurston had bathed baby Everett and swallowed him tight, she came out on the porch holding him and found us there. Why are you two out here not even talking? You have a fight? No, Well then, in the warming presence of her mother, Zora let loose some of her fears. Mama, what do you suppose happened to old lady Bronson? Mrs. Hurston raised an eyebrow. Didn't you say she fell? Zora shook her head. No, ma'am. We found her on the rocks under that ledge, but when we left her this afternoon, she sat as firmly as a potted plant. I just don't see how she could have slipped. What are you saying, child? Do you think someone pushed her? Zora's voice trembled, and I saw her mother's whole body change to her. I reckon not. She's a tough bird. Besides, there's not a soul in Eatonville who would dare to harm a hair on her head. Oh, Mama. Zora stopped herself for the shortest instant, then she looked her mother square in the eye. You know about ghosts. Mrs. Hurston made a face like Zora had just spoken to her in Seminole. Say what now? What ghost is this? Ghost the gator, Mama. The one that killed poor Sonny Rapt and then disappeared. Just disappeared. Oh, that ghost. Mrs. Hurston sat down between us on the porch step and pulled Zora to her. That was a terrible thing. Poor foolish boy. She shook her head. But, Mama, how could Ghost just up and disappear, big as he is? He's the size of 3 of Daddy laid end to end, yet nobody can find him. It don't make sense unless... Mrs. Hurston's eyes hooded. Unless? Zora shifted, unsure how far she could go. Well, what if Ghost could turn into a man, or a man into Ghost? Then nobody would know. Mrs. Hurston turned to me. Carrie, you think men and gators turning into each other, too? I looked at my friend, who was nestled against her mamma's shoulder, and shrugged. I don't know what kind of face I had on, but I guess it was the kind that made Mrs. Hurston pull me in under her other arm, while her knees kept baby Everett rocking gently in her lap. Listen up, both y'all. I never seen a gator turned man, or a man turned gator, or any such thing in my whole life. I never even heard of one till now, but I'll tell you what. Gators is bad enough, and if you ever see one, either of you go straight up the first tree you can find here. Don't never think you can outrun a gator, but you can sure outclimb one. She pulled us in tight. Honestly, you girls, she chuckled, and it was hard for me not to smile, too. But Zora stayed serious. You know Mr. Pender, Mama? The baby started fussing, and Mrs. Houston picked him up to cradle. I know him to say hello. Your father says he's a fine carpenter, but works too slow. He's not the friendliest squirrel in the nest, but he does his work and minds his business. When the baby settled, Mrs. Hurston cocked her head. Why, what about Mr. Pender? Zora looked off at the moon. Oh, no reason, just wondering. But she kept frowning. What's the matter, baby? Mrs. Hurston asked. You still fretting about gators? No, Mama, I just got to thinking of Miss Billy and old lady Bronson. Will you promise never to go to the Blue Sink by yourself? Mrs. Hurston smiled. I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Zora Neale. First of all, you know I can't swim, and I don't like fishing, so I don't know why I would ever want to go to Blue Sink. Second of all, when is the last time you ever saw me alone? She nodded toward baby Everett, who stirred in her arms as if on cue. And finally, if I ever come up missing, it'll be because I turned on my heels with something real important to do. And if that real important thing ever came up, you know I'd be mighty obliged to take you with me. You would, Mama? Really? Of course I would. You're the only one around this house that moves in step with me. She glanced at Everett, who was starting to fuss himself awake again. Oh, Mama. Zora smiled and wrapped her arms around her mother's neck. Oh, Zora Neale. She touched her forehead to her daughter's. Now both of you come inside and get some studying done before Carrie has to go home. I'm going to try to put Everett to bed before he thinks it's time for another feeding. At that moment, Everett let out a full-on wail, and Mrs. Houston began to dandle him like he was in a buggy on a bad road. Oh, Lord, this baby just wake up because I went and mentioned food. Zora and I quizzed each other on our multiplication tables and took turns spelling the names of all 45 states, but Zora had to keep reminding me when it was my turn. All I could think of was how I wanted to run home and hug my own mama as hard as I could.